Chop on chop is basically dry brushing black and white underpainting, and then we use speed paints on top. And then once that dries, we do another round of dry brushing with white paint, mostly on the highlight areas. And then we do another round of speed paints, but this time with lighter colored speed paints. In this manner, we create more color depth and more contrast to our painting.
It's becoming increasingly difficult to paint and create videos since the holidays are here. Christmas in the Philippines is overwhelming. However, I might still manage to create a couple of videos before the year ends. We're excited to share our very first compilation video featuring our unique speed painting technique. You might know it as Slapchop on Slapchop or Chop on Chop, but we've decided to call it the Double Slapchop Plus since the former was a bit of a mouthful. We hope you enjoy watching it as much as we enjoyed creating it. I refined and enhanced all 6 videos by removing the intros and negative comments at the start of some, along with the distracting Kickstarter plugs and outros. I focused on showcasing the core messages in a more impactful way. Editing this compilation video was fun. It shows the evolution of our double slop chop technique and speed painting process. I'm excited to share my new approach soon, which I'm calling the reverse slop chop or chop suey.
In today's video, we'll talk about speed highlighting or highlighting with speed paints. Highlighting with speed paints will never be as good or will never look as good as highlighting with Warpaints Fanatic or highlighting with regular acrylic paints. Now, I have always said this, speed paints render the best over very detailed miniatures. However, highlighting detailed miniatures can be a nightmare. It can be very time-consuming. Now today, we're painting a very detailed miniature from clay cyanide, and we're going to use speed paints. However, like I said, we're going to do highlighting also with speed paints. We start by painting the base colors. I have decided on the color scheme already and have pre-selected the colors. I primed the model already with black spray can primer and then on top, gray spray can primer. Now we dry brush some white so that we finish our dry brush under painting. As usual, we're using Warpaints Fanatic Matte White. Now you could see in the video, I'm not unloading on a piece of towel so that I would do heavier dry brushing. When you want heavier dry brushing, you may unload on your table or mixing dish or even on the model itself. For the base colors, you could apply multiple passes of the same color. Make sure to create volume by painting more on the shade areas for the second and third passes. Also make sure to let dry in between layers. As always, I recommend that you use synthetic brushes when using your speed paints. Also, do not use your wet palette because speed paints will stain the wet palette foam. Work faster and use a bigger brush so that you won't create coffee stains. Work faster but try to control where the paints are running around the areas of the model. I really love this process of using speed paints as my base colors. This is very efficient, very fast, and not that time consuming. However, for lighter colors like this one, Peachy Flesh, you may want to apply this color in 2 passes. Always allow the previous layers to dry before you apply a second pass. Now we paint our second main color. I decided to use Fire Orange Giant to give this monster a sort of crab-like shell. Now you need to work faster for speed paints like this Fire Orange Giant, which has more saturation. If you're not comfortable painting such a saturated color, you may thin down a little bit with Speed Paint Medium. If you want to paint faster, do not use the hair dryer. You could paint a certain area away from the other area. For example, you painted the armor part, and while that armor part is drying, you could paint the base, like the base of the miniature. And then by the time you're finished with the base, most likely, the other area you previously painted will be dry already. Then you could really speed up the painting or the drying time by using the hair dryer. But use the hair dryer once like the speed paints has settled on the crevices for maybe at least 5 to 10 minutes. Now once you've painted the base colors, you could now add more color depth and contrast to your painting. Now we do highlighting with speed paints. So we need to dry brush some areas again with white paint. You may use a smaller dry brush if you want smaller highlight areas. Also, you may want to apply this in a couple of passes. First, we get a dry brush and dry brush areas that we want more highlights on. And of course, you could use white or other colors like beige and tans, but white is pretty safe. I mean, it's very neutral and it will give you the most vibrant highlights. After applying a couple of passes of dry brushing, key here is to select a different color. Could be a lighter color or a color that matches your previous base colors. Do not use your previous base colors because it won't give you additional color depth to your painting. After a couple of passes of white dry brushing, we now have a nice foundation for our highlights and complementary base colors. Now we use Ghillie Doo, which is a very vibrant yellowish green color. As you can see in the video, we're producing a very vibrant finish because of the white underpainting. When you're adding another color on a limited area over a previous color, you need to blend the edges of the speed paint. I usually use speed paint medium for this purpose for blending the edges of speed paint. However, you could see in the video, water will work. The main advantage of using speed paint medium when blending the edges is that it's not as runny as water, so you simply do not need to wick your brush too much. Also, if you blend with speed paint medium, I feel or I think that your finish will be a lot more stronger. However, like what you see in this video, water will work mighty fine. Lastly, if you want to have a darker finish, you may want to skip the white dry brushing or the foundation color. Or you could simply apply the Ghillie Doo in a couple of passes. Now we use Cloudburst Blue. This is a very dark blue color, but this will be a nice complementary color to our orange armor. Being a complementary color, this dark blue color will make our orange shell look more vibrant. Now we paint Carmine Dragon for the last parts or the mouth parts of this model. This color is too saturated. This color is very nice and vibrant. However, as you can see in the video, it's kinda killing my highlights. It's very saturated and we're losing the highlights that we want. If you find the color, the speed paint color, too saturated to your liking and you're not getting the result that you want, you simply thin it down with speed paint medium. A good starting point for thinning down very saturated speed paints is roughly around 2 parts speed paint and 1 part medium. For lighter colors though, you should thin it a lot less. You could also use this technique to add more shade colors, like you could dry brush white and then add more purple shade areas on some sides or some areas of the models. So you could do dry brush and then highlight colors, dry brush and then shade colors, and then dry brush again and more highlight colors. This will give your painting so much color depth without too much effort. Now we need to do another round of dry brushing so that we don't need to paint all those teeth. I'm using the Army Painter dry brush here because it's a little smaller than my Foxbite dry brush. As usual, you may want a couple of passes of the dry brushing to have better coverage. Initially, I just wanted to dry brush the teeth areas, but then again, I eventually decided to dry brush the whole model. Now, we have to do another round of speed painting or painting with speed paints. Another round of speed paints is not really that time consuming since we have the base colors already. For the skin, I decided to use the same color that we use for the base color. I used the same color for the skin tone to show that because of the dry brushing, This layer of speed paint will give you more volume because the recessed areas will become darker, however, the raised areas will become lighter. However, and this is a big however, I recommend that you use a different color for this part of the painting process. Now you could see I'm using Zealot Yellow, which is a lighter color than our base color. Our base color for the shell was Fire Orange Giant. This time, Zealot Yellow is a lighter yellow-orange, more yellow than the previous base color. The Zealot Yellow being more yellowish than our previous color will give more color depth and color contrast to our painting. Now we paint the teeth. Normally I use palette bone. However, I want darker recesses, more contrast, so I decided to use bony matter. If you want more color to your teeth, you may dry brush with beige and tans before using speed paints. Now let's finish off the painting by using some effects paints. I'm using slime and vomit and some gloss varnish so that we have like areas that are more glossy and slimy in comparison to the very matte finish of the speed paints. Similar to speed paints, I recommend synthetic brushes when painting with effects paints. Because of the gloss varnish component of some of these effects paints, I highly recommend you do not use your precious Kolinsky brushes. Effects paints are super fun, so apply as generously as you want. You may want to apply these paints in multiple passes. Just make sure to let dry in between coats. The disgusting slime looks too bright when the paint is wet, but don't worry because it will dry to a very nice semi-gloss finish. Highlighting is the highlight of your miniature painting. Okay, that's word salad, but it's true. But highlighting, especially a very detailed miniature, can be very time consuming unless you highlight with speed paints. It's funny that these days one could argue that you could paint highly or overly detailed miniatures faster because of speed paints. Now imagine painting all those teeth with regular acrylics or war paints fanatic. Minus the drying time, the painting of this overly detailed clay cyanide miniature could be roughly around less than a couple of hours. So you saw in this video that you could paint a fairly nice looking miniature with just a handful of speed paints and of course white paint. The base color, dry brush, speed paint, dry brush again, and speed paint is very versatile. So I highly recommend you play around with this technique to come up with very nicely painted miniatures. If you watch my older speed painting, or not even speed painting but my older painting videos, I'm not that fond of using the dry brush. However, I must admit that I'm enjoying dry brushing a ton more because of my Army Painter dry brushes and of course my Foxbite dry brushes. I've used the Foxbite 7 Deadly Sins synthetic brush set for a couple of times now. And I think I could recommend it to you guys already. And if you want a 10% discount, do check out my description below.
The first double Slapchop painting was a bit of an accident, but this next video is not. The reel of this dwarf bust painting on Facebook has 1.2 million views at the moment. Crazy! Also, this video helped push this channel to 50,000 subscribers.
Today we paint Slapchop on Slapchop, or shall we call it shorter chop on chop. Chop on chop was sort of an accidental technique when I was painting my previous miniature, or in my previous video. In my last video, I wanted to create more contrast and more color depth, but I wanted to just use speed paints. So we kinda came up with this Slapchop on Slapchop, or chop on chop. Today, we're painting a creature caster miniature. And we're painting with Army Painter speed paints and of course a little bit of War Paints Fanatic. Now we do the first round of Slapchop. This is a Zenithal Prime. I started with black primer and then gray primer and then white primer. The gray primer and white primer were painted mostly on the top left area of the model. To finish off the Zenithal Prime, we then dry brush white paint with my Foxbite dry brush. I applied the white paint via dry brush in a couple of passes to get really good coverage. Normally, I would advise for synthetic brushes, but for this one, I use a bigger number 3 Kolinsky brush. Now we apply the first round of speed paints. We start with Peachy Flesh, but Crusader Skin is also a good option. I almost always apply light colored speed paints twice to get a darker like finish to my painting. I like a darker base for my speed paint so that the highlighting later will be more prominent, especially for this technique which is chop on chop. We want a darker base so that the second round of speed paints will be more prominent. Now we're painting with Age Hide. Age Hide doesn't give you nice midtones, but it does give you very nice dark recesses. I usually encounter problems with hardened leather because it's too saturated. So if you're having problems with hardened leather, simply thin it down with speed paints medium. Also, if you're working with very saturated speed paints, make sure to work fast and use a bigger brush. Now we're painting with Zealot Yellow. I like Zealot Yellow because it gives me more contrast than the other yellows, especially Maize Yellow and Pastel Yellow. Those pastel-ish colors doesn't give the same contrast as Zealot Yellow. Camo Cloak is similar to hardened leather. It's very saturated, so if you're having problems, you may want to thin it down with speed paints medium. A good starting point for thinning down dark colored speed paints is roughly around 3 parts speed paint and 1 part medium. You saw in the video that a thinned down dark colored speed paint gives you enough coverage but at the same time gives you more control. Cloudburst Blue is very saturated, but this is only our base since we're going to do another round of Slapchop. Now you need to let this dry, and if you want, you could give this a quick coat of matte varnish. Now here are the speed paints that we used so far. The painting of the first round of Slapchop took me roughly less than an hour. If you decided to use matte varnish on top of the speed paints, I would recommend you let that cure for around 6 hours. Now once you've painted all the base colors with speed paints, we move on to doing the second round of Slapchop. Now we do another round of dry brushing with matte white. As usual, I'm using my Foxbite dry brush. Now you need to dry brush in 2 passes or even 3 to give you the best coverage. Depending on the finish that you want to achieve, you may apply the dry brushing only on the highlight areas or all over the model. If you want to finish faster, you could actually dry brush highlight colors like beige and tans and you're practically finished. The second round of Slapchop of this chop on chop technique should be faster, easier, and more fun. Like you just need to paint lighter colors on top of the previous Slapchop. And for sure, you're going to create more contrast and more color depth. Now, the second round of Slapchop is the most exciting part because you can really see the model as you finish or as you apply more speed paints. Try to experiment with different colors, different speed paints, and you could also use washes if you want more subtle effects. If you do decide to use the same colors that you use for the base colors, you will still produce better volume than with the standard Slapchop. But I do recommend that you use different colors, different lighter colors so that you create more volume and also create more color depth to your painting. At this point of the painting, I was actually thinking that you could do chop on chop on chop until you're happy with the result. I think chop on chop on chop on chop is like it's going to look good as you fine tune the highlights. It's a matter of just painting more highlights or doing dry brushing on the highlight areas as you fine tune your painting. Like I said earlier, use lighter colors or even more vibrant colors than the colors that you use for the base. This one I'm using algae green and it's painted over the camo cloak earlier. Using more speed paint simply means more color depth. For the second round of Slapchop, if you decide to use very saturated speed paints, I recommend you thin it down with speed paint medium. For the second round, you may want to thin down very dark and very saturated speed paints around 2 parts speed paints and 1 part speed paint medium. More speed paint medium means more transparency. However, you may need to apply it in more passes so that you get better coverage. Now we are finished with our chop on chop painting. Similar to the first round, you may want to apply a quick matte varnish. Now we are done. You can see that I added a bit more highlighting to the painting because it's a bust. It's so big. It's a display piece. But again, you saw that chop on chop was a very good starting point for this miniature, for this creature caster bust. Like I said earlier, I think we could do chop on chop on chop on chop until we're happy with the result. I did not film on video the highlighting with Warpaints Fanatic because it doesn't serve any purpose for this video. But I kinda applied more painting with Warpaints Fanatic, especially on the gold NMM and a little bit on the OSL on the beard. And of course, I painted the eyes and improved the painting of the fur of the bear on the right shoulder armor. However, I must say that our chop on chop technique was a really good starting point even if you plan to do a really nice display level painting. Our chop on chop technique took roughly around 2 hours including the drying time. So I think our chop on chop painting technique is a very good starting point even if you plan to do display level painting. But of course, you have to finish with regular acrylics or Warpaints Fanatic. So, have you tried our chop on chop technique and did you get good results? Tell me at the comment section below.
The next video is the third model painted via our double slop chop speed painting technique. At this point, I am fully aware of what speed paint colors to use for layering. This Cthulhu bust is also the main promo video of our The Black Tide Kickstarter.
Today we paint another miniature via our chop on chop speed painting technique. This video was designed for people who want to try to paint their very first bust. One could argue that painting a bust is easier than painting a small miniature because it's bigger. It can be a little bit more time consuming if you simply use regular acrylics. But if you paint via our chop on chop speed painting technique, I think you will enjoy painting your first bust. Now, key to painting your first bust is to select a miniature, a bust like this one, which doesn't have too much accessories or details. Like this one is just skin, a little bit of teeth, and a little bit of eyes, a ton of eyes. But basically, you're just painting skin. You can paint it in any color that you want. So it's easier because you don't have to deal with NMM, with skin, with cloth, with hair. So it's easier to paint like a bust that is a creature or a monster. So we start the painting with a zenithal-ish prime with black primer and then gray primer. And then we finish off the zenithal or the underpainting with matte white from Warpaints Fanatic via dry brush. Always dry brush a couple of passes to get good coverage. Also apply more layers on the highlight areas. Now we apply more highlighting and more texturing with white glazes. I don't usually do this, especially for smaller miniatures, but this is great for bigger miniatures like this bust. Also apply the white glazes in multiple passes to achieve great results. You may also use an airbrush if you're good with airbrush control. Just make sure to add medium so that you're applying white glazes with the airbrush. Normally, I would use synthetic brushes when using speed paints, but I'm really enjoying using these Foxbite Kolinsky brushes. Now we apply our first round of speed paints. We start our painting with Peachy Flesh. I really like this color because it gives very nice midtones. Now, keys to good renders with speed paints is to work fast, also try to paint wet on wet, and lastly, try to blend the edges if you can. Now you could see in the video, I'm blending the edges with speed paint medium, but of course, you could use water. The main advantage of using speed paint medium for blending is that it makes the paints dry slower. Now I need a bigger brush, so I'm using my squirrel hair brush. It's also natural hair and it's great for washes and speed paints, but make sure to wash it immediately after using because you want to preserve this brush as much as you can because it's not cheap. So whenever you decide to use Kolinsky or any natural hair brush with your speed paints or washes, just make sure to wash it thoroughly after using. Now I find this color too saturated, so you could see that I'm diluting it a little bit with speed paint medium. This will delay or slow the drying time so that it's easier to blend the edges, and of course it will add a bit more transparency. Now because of the speed paint medium, the drying time was slower, so I needed to use the hair dryer before applying a second coat. Now you could see in the video, because of the speed paint medium, it was easier to blend the edges, but still you get pretty good saturation. Now we paint our main color, which is algae green. This is a very nice, vibrant, yellowish green color. Now you may find this color a little bit too saturated too, so you may want to thin this down with speed paint medium. A good ratio would be around 3 parts paint, 3 parts algae green, and 1 part speed paint medium. 3:1 is a very good starting point, but you may add a little bit more or less depending on the effects that you want. Like I said earlier, clean your brush thoroughly after using. Now once you're happy with your first round of Slapchop, we then do the second round of Slapchop. That's why this is chop on chop. And make sure that the speed paints are dry already, maybe around 30 minutes to an hour. Or if you want, you could apply a quick coat of matte varnish but let that cure for roughly around 6 hours. Once the previous painting is cured, semi-cured, you can now move on to painting white paint and dry brush it over the miniature, especially around the highlight areas, and then another round of speed paints. Try to apply multiple passes instead of heavy dry brushing during this painting process. Now you see in the video that our bust is ready for its second round of speed paints. It's important to note that the dry brushing, the white dry brushing you see right now, is multiple passes of dry brushing white paint, not one heavy coat. Now we apply the second round of speed paints. I would like to remind you guys that this is not painting. As long as you use speed paints or contrast paints, and even if you apply multiple passes, still, this is not painting, like what our commenter said at the start of the video. Kidding aside, you could see that I'm applying multiple layers, multiple passes of skin tones on the upper areas of the tentacles because I want the tentacles near the face to be skin or to be more fleshy than the tips of the tentacles. When applying multiple layers of speed paints or washes, make sure that you let dry in between layers. Letting dry in between layers will always give you the best results. You could also see in the video that I'm applying more speed paints on the shade areas where I think there will be more shadows and thus it will make it darker and it will create more volume to the overall painting. Now we move on to using Purple Alchemy. This color you might find too saturated, so you may want to thin this down a little bit with speed paint medium. Now I'm applying this color on the lower half of the tentacles. This gives me nice transition from the fleshier tones near the face and like a more purple magenta color towards the tips of the tentacles. Now you could see me blending the edges with speed paint medium. If you're not good at blending edges with speed paint medium or with just water, I recommend you thin this color down a bit more with speed paint medium and apply in multiple layers. In that manner, you have a little bit more control. Now we're going to use Thunderbird Blue. This color, same as the other pastel-ish speed paint colors, are a little bit too opaque. And if you don't thin it down with medium or just water, it will be like you will lose the contrast that you created in the previous layers. Now we're using Gilly Dew. This color is perfect even if you don't thin it down with speed paint medium. However, you saw that I kinda added a little bit of speed paint medium because I want the painting to be not too vibrant. Gilly Dew is our main color, and you could see in the video that it's blending very nicely over the previous layers. Now you could see in the video that the main advantage of our chop-on-chop technique is that it has way more color depth than your standard slop chop. I think it's safe to say that chop-on-chop is twice better than any single slop chop you see here at YouTube. So, kidding aside, you could see in the video right now that chop on chop will give you very good results because you're doing slop chop twice. And even if you plan to do more highlighting later with Warpaint's Fanatic, this is a very good starting point. But again, I'm reminding you guys that this is not painting. Now, before my final thoughts, a huge thanks to all my patrons at Patreon, Hajime Model Studio, and of course, the Army Painter for making this video possible. Our chop-on-chop speed painting technique, similar to slop chop, is very low stress and low focus. So it's very relaxing, but at the same time, very satisfying or fulfilling once you see the final results. However, I must admit, since I need to use the photos and this video to promote our Kickstarter, I had to do more layering to make the painting a little bit more refined. You can see in the video right now, I'm adding more magentas and desaturated purples. Because these colors you can't really layer on top of previous colors unless you do another round of dry brushing, which will work. You could do chop, on chop, on chop, and on chop. But I just find that a little bit too inefficient already if you do it too many times. But of course, if you really enjoy this process, of course you could do chop on chop on chop on chop. Just make sure you use I would advise you use a smaller dry brush as you paint more highlight colors. However, of course, you can replace the efficiency and the amount of control of true painting, which is painting with regular acrylic paints. So after a little bit of highlighting with Warpaint's Fanatic, of course, painting of the eyes and painting of the teeth, there are so many teeth, and of course, adding some purple colors to make the painting look more fancy, and I can now call this done. Now the purple shadows and the magentas on the shade areas is just to make the painting look fancy, to make it look more quote-unquote artistic. Although I must admit that it doesn't really look cohesive or realistic. But again, sometimes you just want to make it look artistic. Simply put, painting more texture, especially using purples and magentas and even dark blues, so that it has more color depth and more colors, will make you look like a better painter.
The next video got 1,000 subscribers in 3 days. This was the very first 32mm Warhammer painting via our double slop chop speed painting technique. This was a bit of an experiment as I wanted a more weathered look to the armor parts. I think this ultramarine came out fine.
Today we paint another miniature via our chop-on-chop speed painting technique. I always recommend that you use synthetic brushes for speed paints and washes, but I am enjoying these Foxbite brushes, Kulinski brushes, too much. The initial idea here is to come up with a grim dark space marine. So if you've been watching my older videos, this is practically my old sepia or brown underpainting. However, the main difference is that we're using speed paints for the first time for the sepia brownish underpainting. Like what I always say, work fast, use a bigger brush, and work wet on wet as much as you can so that you prevent coffee stains. I applied hardened leather with just a single coat because I find it too saturated already, but I want deeper crevices, so now we're using bony matter. Bony matter has weak midtones, and we thinned it down a little bit with speed paint medium so it will have weaker midtones. However, it will give us darker crevices and more contrast. I applied bony matter all over the model, especially on the shade areas. Now let bony matter settle for around 10 minutes before using the hair dryer to speed up the drying time. I did not apply matte varnish here, but I let this cure for an hour. Now once you're happy with your first round of Slapchop, we then do another round of Slapchop. But make sure that the speed paints are dry already, at least maybe around 30 minutes before you dry brush white primer or white paint over the speed paint. Now we do our second round of dry brushing. Apply multiple passes of dry brushing with white paint. However, apply more on the top areas to give a sense of lighting to your miniature. Dry brush paint dries pretty fast, so you could do multiple passes in like quick succession. Do not worry if you overdo this step, because no matter how much you apply, no matter how much white paint you dry brush on the model, once you apply your second round of speed paints, your previous Slapchop will show through. Our second round of Slapchop here is our actual colors. As you can see, I'm painting peachy flesh on the flesh tones and some other colors for the other parts of the model. So in hindsight, you could actually do a triple Slapchop with the painting of the Space Marine, since our first round of Slapchop was just our brown underpainting. Oh, it's important to note that as I paint the smaller areas, as you can see, I'm using a smaller brush. Other than using a smaller brush, key to painting smaller elements or smaller areas with the speed paints is the loading of your brush. If you apply too much speed paint, feel free to wick it with your brush so that you prevent or you eliminate too much pooling. Now we're painting with palette bone. This color is a little bit too weak. The midtones are weak, so you may want to apply this in a couple of passes. Now we paint the main color, which is magic blue. I chose magic blue because I want it to really pop on the table. But this color is a little bit too saturated. So you could see that I thinned it down a little bit with speed paint medium. You don't really have to use speed paint medium to thin down your speed paints every time. However, unlike thinning down with water, speed paint medium doesn't make the speed paint too runny. It gives it the same consistency, same viscosity, but with less saturation and more transparency. More transparency and a slower drying time will give you more control, since you could blend the edges while it's still wet and you could apply in multiple passes. Now you could see in the video, since we use a complementary-ish color, which is the red-brown or orange-brown underpainting, and then we're painting blue, which is complementary-ish to that color, we're getting a very dark shade color as we layer the transparent blue on top. So obviously, our double Slapchop technique is giving us more contrast. Normally, when I thin down speed paints with speed paint medium, I'll apply the color in a couple of passes. But with this one, I'm happy with the saturation already. Now, if you're curious if you could use Speed Paint 1.0 over the second round of Slapchop, you could. And I actually highly recommend it because you could blend those colors easily and you could blend the edges and you will not produce coffee stains. Now you could see in the video, unlike the blue, magic blue over the previous Slapchop, this gray color is not covering the previous Slapchop as much. So you're getting a very nice rusted effect on the gray areas. At this point, you could actually shift to regular acrylics if you find it easier to paint small details with Warpaint's Fanatic. Now, if you commit errors and paint like reds on the other parts of the miniature, do not go back to doing Slapchop. Just correct those with regular acrylics. Now, you could paint the gold trims with regular like Warpaint's Fanatic, but for some odd reason, the Speed Paint's Metallics has very good coverage. But make sure you load the brush properly so that you don't paint all over the miniature. Needless to say, especially if the metallic part is bigger, using Speed Paint's Metallics is so much easier than using regular acrylics. However, if you're not used to loading your brush with Speed Paint, especially Speed Paint Metallics, you could always use regular acrylics. Now we use burnish red for the painting of the base. I thinned this down roughly around 2 parts burnish red and 1 part Speed Paint medium. Like I always say, 3 parts Speed Paint and 1 part Speed Paint medium is a very good starting point. However, you could go as far as 1:1 and you will get good control and good results, especially depending on the color. Now we are finished with our double Slapchop or chop on chop, and I think after painting the trims black, this is tabletop ready. The two obvious advantages of doing double Slapchop or chop on chop is that you get really good contrast and even good color depth. The brown foundation color or the brown first round Slapchop gave us very nice contrast, especially after painting the actual colors. Now, like what I said earlier, you could actually do a triple Slapchop with the painting of this Space Marine. You could do another round of dry brushing white paint and then paint highlights on top. But as you can see in the video, I decided to shift to regular acrylics already. I decided to shift to Warpaint's Fanatic for the painting of the small details and of course the highlights. It's important to note though that when I'm layering on top of the double Slapchop, I'm using Warpaint's Fanatic thinned down with Warpaint Stabilizer. I thin down Warpaint's Fanatic roughly around 4 parts or 3 parts paint and 1 part Warpaint Stabilizer. I call this fat glazes. So I think it's obvious. The main advantage of doing double Slapchop is that I get really fast midtones and even shade colors. And I have a good foundation for painting on top with regular acrylics or with Warpaint's Fanatic. Since the painting of the base color, the shades with speed paints is super fast, I have the energy and the enthusiasm to paint more highlights as you can see in the video. And since I'm going for a grim pop finish, like a very bright miniature with popping colors, but I want it to look a little bit grim, as you can see, I painted a lot of scratches. Now the double Slapchop, I think I spent less than 2 hours, maybe just 1 hour, but less than 2 hours including the drying time. And that was super fast, and then I had so much time improving and refining the painting. The painting of the highlights, the details, the texturing, the scratches, the scuffs took me roughly around maybe 2 or even 3 hours. So overall painting took me around 4 or 5 hours, which is pretty good if this was an HQ or captain of your army. So like I always say, our double Slapchop is a very good starting point, and you could like leave the grunts and the troops with just double Slapchop and continue to refine the painting of the HQs.
Now, the next video is our 5th time to paint a miniature via our double Slapchop plus speed painting technique. And this time we paint a Warhammer Orc. This painting was extra fun as I love painting green skin. However, the new Slapchop method that I will launch soon is because of this video.
Today we paint another miniature via our double Slapchop plus speed painting technique. We start again with Zenital-ish prime, which is like the model was primed black with black primer, and then gray primer mostly from the top, and then white primer sometimes mostly from the top too, and finish off with white dry brushing. As usual, we're using my Foxbite goat hair dry brush. These dry brushes come in two sizes, and we're using the smallest one. As usual, we're using matte white from Warpaint's Fanatic. This paint has very good coverage. Apply the dry brushing in a couple of passes to get the best results. Now, since we let the primers cure overnight and we use matte white from Warpaint's Fanatic, you could immediately start with the speed paints. Now, save your Kolinsky brushes and use synthetic brushes for speed paints. Now, like what I said at the start of the video, we're using safer selection of colors in the painting of this arc. Basically, we're using analogous colors. Analogous colors are colors that appear next to each other on the color wheel. For example, red, orange, and yellow are analogous colors. Now, when combining analogous colors, it's safer. Well, not really safe. Safer is not the right word. I think it's when you're layering and combining analogous colors, it's more predictable. And yet, you create very nice color depth and very vibrant results. Almost like the opposite effect of layering and mixing complementary colors. Now, complementary colors, as most of you or all of you know, are colors opposite each other in the color wheel. Like, for example, red and green, violet and yellow, blue and orange. Now, complementary colors are really nice if you paint them beside each other. Like, for example, you paint the fur reddish brown, and then the skin, as you see here, bluish, and then the leather parts or the skull parts are ochre-ish, yellowish. So it's really nice if you paint them beside each other. However, mixing complementary colors or layering them, especially if you're working with transparent paints, is kinda tricky. Depending on the actual colors that you're using and also depending on the paints, the pigments on the paints, you might end up with a muddy color. Now you see here, we're finished with the first round of Slapchop. Notice that I used darker colors for the first round of Slapchop. Normally, when you're just doing single Slapchop or just painting with speed paints, I recommend you start with the lighter colors as your base colors. And then just use the darker colors as like a wash, like as your shade colors. But since we plan to do dry brushing white on top, I decided to use darker colors. Now let's apply analogous colors. Now once you're happy with your first round of Slapchop, we do the process all over again. And then we dry brush with white primer all over the model but mostly on the top areas. Now let's do another round of dry brushing. Apply in multiple passes and apply with light strokes. Let dry in between passes and apply more on the top areas. Now since we use Warpaint's Fanatic from Army Painter and it's very compatible with speed paints, you could immediately proceed to painting with speed paints. Now, since we're playing it safe in terms of the colors, again, we're using analogous colors over the previous Slapchop. Well, except for the base or the groundwork. I wanted to I really like the effect of using complementary colors. Like this one, we use Tyrian Navy, I think, and it's blue. And then we use orange, brown, hardened leather on top. So this one, the dark areas, the shade areas will be very dark. And it gave me very nice, interesting results. Important to note though that the hardened leather here is thinned down with speed paint medium. Now we proceed to painting the red. We're using a bright red color on top of the previous slaughter red, which is dark red. Speed Paint's blood red looks a bit like red orange to me, so that's analogous or an analogous color to the previous color. Now we're painting some yellow brown color on top of the previously more red brown color, and this will give us very nice color depth. Now we're painting a very bright yellow green color on top of the blue green that we use in the first round of Slapchop. As you can see in the video, the combination of these two analogous colors are creating very nice contrast and very nice color depth. Also, I really like the combination of colors that we use on the base. Now, if you're getting value out of this video, do give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Now we use Ghillie Doo, which is usually very bright if you're just doing single Slapchop. But since we layered it on top of Lizard Folk Cyan, we created like a different effect for our orc skin. Now if you want a brighter orc skin, you could use a different, more yellow-green color. Another option is to use Charming Chartreuse, and that will give you a more yellowish finish to your orc skin. Now here are the colors that we use for the second round of our Slapchop. Now once you're happy with your double Slapchop, you could proceed to the plus part. That's why I call it double Slapchop plus, because the plus is the painting of the highlights. Now we finish off the painting of the model by applying more glaze layering, or what I usually call fat glazes, and of course detail painting and some highlights. I was very happy with the results of our double Slapchop. We created very nice, we utilized very nice color combinations that were safe because they're analogous, but we came up with very interesting results. However, I wanted the skin to be smoother, I wanted to paint more highlights, and of course paint more details, so that I won't get comments that I'm not doing any painting. I spent roughly around a little more than an hour for the double Slapchop, including the drying time. However, for the glazing, layering, and detail painting, I think I spent around 4 hours. Now I realized something while looking at this collage. If you're painting an army of orcs, you could actually use different values of blues and blue-greens and cyan and turquoise for the first round of Slapchop, and then use different yellow-greens and greens or even yellows for your second round of Slapchop. In that manner, you create different orc skin variations with very little effort. Now you could see that the final result, I did a lot of highlighting and texturing and painting off the flames on the groundwork, but it's important to know that obviously double Slapchop or even single Slapchop is a very good foundation for painting the miniature and making it better with layering, glazes, and of course highlighting. So it's, like I always say, it's a very good starting point. So the troops, if you have 10 or 15 or 20 orcs, it will look good painted via double Slapchop. But if you want to paint the HQ a little bit more and spend more time on it, again like this one, what you see on the video, then you could do so. And layering on top of the speed paint, especially double Slapchop, is easier because it's a little bit darker. And of course, the double Slapchop gave you, it will give you very nice shade colors and very solid midtones. So it's all a matter of just putting highlights to finish the model. The midtones, the very solid coverage of the midtones, is actually another advantage of double Slapchop over single Slapchop.
Our last video in this compilation video is the painting of Red Sonia from clay cyanide. At this point, we have learned a fair amount of painting via our double Slapchop plus speed painting technique. I saw some flaws with the method, especially when painting skin. Thus, I will launch my reverse Slapchop or chop suey method very soon.
Today we're painting a clay cyanide miniature. We are not using grays and eventually white highlights for the underpainting today. We are using browns and tans, that's why I call this Warm Slapchop Plus. Start with a dark brown color over the black primer. Remove paint on your dry brush, apply with light pressure and in multiple passes. I always say this, especially with my older speed paint videos. Dry brushing is less efficient than using your airbrush for the underpainting. However, for people who doesn't want to bring out or use their airbrush, or for people that doesn't have an airbrush, dry brushing is a very relaxing and enjoyable painting method. Although dry brushing is not as efficient as using the airbrush for the underpainting, dry brushing, the main advantage is that you don't paint over the deeper crevices. Especially if you apply very little pressure, you won't be able to paint the crevices and the deeper details of the miniature, creating more contrast. Also, when highlighting, I use a bigger dry brush so that I won't be painting the tighter areas with the lighter colors. Dry brushing and painting with washes or speed paints are the most relaxing way to paint miniatures. However, if you're going for a finer finish with your dry brushing, that could be time-consuming. As much as I want to tell you that I only spend roughly around 10 minutes in the dry brushing, no, I spent a good hour with this dry brushing. However, like I said, dry brushing is very enjoyable, relaxing, and practically focus-free. After the dry brush underpainting, now we are ready for the first round of speed paints. We have an option to paint with bony matter or pallid bone. However, I chose pallid bone. Bony matter will give you darker shades. However, we don't need that since we're doing double slap chop. Also, bony matter will be too analogous with the skin color, which is the most dominant part of this miniature, so I decided with using pallid bone. Now we're using ochre clay. Ochre clay is very saturated. It's way more saturated than pallid bone. The difference between pallid bone and ochre clay is kinda subtle, but it will give us more color depth. We are painting the dead demons purples and magenta so that it has good separation between the groundwork. These complementary-ish colors will give more pop to our painting. Now we use Age Hide. This is a very nice orange skin color. This color is more analogous to our groundwork, thus it will kinda unify the painting of the base. I think it's fairly obvious that you really need to play with the colors of your painting with speed paints, especially if you don't plan to do highlights later. I was really surprised that Ashen Tone has really deep shadows. I like the effect, but I want to tone down the contrast later. This color surprisingly gave very nice contrast, but I want a more white fur. In real life painting, you should paint the skin first. However, this is a YouTube video, so to make you watch more of my video, I'm painting the skin last. Initially, I wanted to paint the boots and the gloves hardened leather, but I wanted to create more separation with the painting of the warm base. As you can see, I'm flip-flopping between warm and cool colors. This will give us better separation in between the different elements and areas of the model. Now we paint Nuclear Sunrise. I love this color. This is very saturated. It's even easier than painting actual oranges with regular paints. Now we're using Fire Drake again. This is an orange skin color and we're using it to paint the handle of the axe. Now we paint the skin. But like I said earlier, you should paint the skin first so that you have a good grasp of the overall painting of the miniature. While painting the skin, I'm thinking of making another video that is focused on skin painting with speed paints. Obviously, I'm not very happy with the result. Now we are done with the first round of Slapchop, and I think this is tabletop ready already. However, we want more contrast and more color depth, so we're going to do a second round of Slapchop. Normally, I would dry brush white over the previous Slapchop, but I wanted a warmer and darker finish for my highlighting later. If you've seen my previous double Slapchop videos, I think it's kinda obvious that I'm using this method to get really dark base colors and more color depth with the shades and the midtones for my highlighting later. However, if you don't plan to paint a ton of highlights and spend too much time on painting a miniature, I recommend you paint with white, you dry brush with white paint, and then thin down your speed paints with medium. Thin down speed paints with medium or water will not darken your midtones too much. However, the thin down speed paint will still glaze and smoothen the dry brushing. Also, if you don't plan to paint a ton of highlights later and you're just going for tabletop plus or tabletop quality painting, I recommend you do not use darker colors. Stay with the brighter and lighter speed paints. Now we paint with Runic Gray. This color is one of those colors that are perfect for the second round. The midtones of Runic Gray has pretty good saturation, and also it will give you more contrast. Now we paint with Holy White. I felt I needed to tone down the painting of the white fur so that it looks more like white fur. Now you could see Holy White perfectly toned down the contrast of the white fur. Now we're using Sand Golem to add more yellow highlights to the orange hair. Now if you paint this color without the dry brushing, you will just darken the painting of the hair. So the dry brushing here is very important. Speed paints and washes were formulated to create more contrast. Thus, without the dry brushing, your painting will become very, very dark as you paint transparent layers on top. Our skin is looking very dark, but this is perfect for my highlights later. Now once you're happy with your double Slapchop, you could proceed to the plus part. That's why I call it double Slapchop plus, because the plus is the painting of the highlights. Now this is definitely tabletop ready and ready for playing, especially if this was a 32mm miniature. However, since this is painting for clay cyanide, we have to paint more highlights to this miniature. If you watch my older videos, you'll know that I love skin painting and glazing. Also in my older videos, I call this part of the painting process flip-flop stage. This is the most time-consuming part of the painting of this miniature. I flip-flop from painting highlights, adding shades, glazing, and then really refine the painting. Basically at this stage, I highlight aggressively and tone it down if need be. Now, before my final thoughts, a huge thanks to all my patrons at Patreon, Hajime Model Studio, and of course, The Army Painter for making this video possible. Now we're done, or at least I call this done. I think it's obvious by now that I'm using the double Slapchop method to create really quick midtones and shade colors. And like in this miniature, I used the double Slapchop method to create a very dark base, which is very nice to make my highlighting more prominent. Oh, by the way, before I forgot, this is a 75mm clay cyanide miniature. Clay Cyanide plans to release some 75mm scale miniatures, and I will collaborate with them for the launch. The 75mm launch could be a Kickstarter or just your regular My Mini Factory launch. Now, like I said, I'm not very happy with the painting of the skin. I had to do a lot of glazes, glaze stippling, and layering on top to make the skin look fairly good, because the dry brushing underpainting kinda gave a very rough painting to the skin. My next video is the painting of the Death Guard Talisman. However, I think I'll create a really quick video on painting skin with speed paints after that video. No, it's not a glazing video. I have a ton of those videos already. It will still be painting with speed paints. Hopefully you saw in this video that the warmer Slapchop, the warmer dry brush underpainting with browns and tans gave us a warmer finish at the end. I kinda like this warmer underpainting a ton more than the usual grays and whites. The warmer underpainting is perfect if the miniature you're painting has a ton of skin or a ton of browns and leathers. Oh, if you're curious, I spend roughly around 8 hours, maybe even 10 hours on the painting of the highlights. Now, if you're just aiming for a tabletop finish, you could do away without the highlighting. However, if you plan better painting, of course you